Ethan has always been a reserved man. His social networks were private. He avoided exposing himself too much and maintained a discreet routine. He liked to attract attention and preferred to go unnoticed. But everything changed when he started that new job. On the first day, one colleague out among the others, Damien, a soft-spoken man with an attentive look, seemed to know too much about him. At first, Ethan saw no evil. It was common for colleagues to bring up a topic to break the ice, so it wasn't surprising when Damien mentioned the coffee shop on the way to work. "Are you arriving with a coffee from Bistro 47? It is good," asked Damien casually. Ethan smiled, surprised. "Yes, it's my favorite." "Do you also shop?" Damien denied with a slight smile. "I've never been, but I noticed that you pass by there every day." The answer made Ethan feel it on the back of his neck. How did Damien know this? Maybe he had just seen him coming a few times and made it casual, but something about the way he said it bothered Ethan. He tried to ignore it. The days and Damien seemed to get closer and closer. He knew what songs Ethan liked, what his lunch hours were, even little details like the fact that always checked his cell phone twice before leaving the table. But it was on a rainy Wednesday that everything... "So Ethan," said Damien casually while working on his computer. "Funny how some things never right. Like that nickname you had when you were a kid, leukemia." The air seemed to disappear from Ethan's lungs. "Hey, what did you say?" Damien laughed as if he had told the most harmless joke in the world. "Leukemia. I bet your mom still calls you that." Doesn't Ethan felt his heart race? No one in the office knew that nickname. No one other than his family and a few childhood friends. He never writ on social media. He never said it out loud in that environment. How did Damien know? "Where did you hear that?" Ethan asked, trying to unconcerned. Damien tilted his head to the side and watched him for a few seconds, as if analyzing his reaction. "I just pay attention," he replied with an enigmatic smile. "I have a good eye for detail." That answer didn't make any sense. Ethan felt a lump in his. Every word from Damien seemed chosen to move him, to provoke some kind of reaction. Over the next few days, Ethan began to small details that he had never noticed before. Damien always seemed to be around. In the cafeteria, at the exit of the building, even the hallways, as if he knew exactly where Ethan would be at every moment of the day. It was then that paranoia began to take over. Why did Damien seem to know so much about him? Would you have researched your life had he spoken to someone from his past? Right, were you Ethan the whole time? The answer to that question Ethan still didn't know, but one thing was certain. He needed to find out before it too late. Damien was the type of person who went unnoticed in any environment. His posture always calm, his smile was constant, and he had a look that seemed to pass through people as if he saw beyond what they showed. But there was something about him that bothered Ethan. From day one, Damien demonstrated a strange knowledge about his life. At first, Ethan to convince himself that he was just an observant coworker, someone who liked to pay attention to details. But as the days went by, Damien became more and more specific, as if he had access to information he shouldn't have. "You know, Ethan, you have a very organized way. He arrives at the same time, leaves at exactly the right time for lunch, and always prefers the table near the window. This is an old habit, isn't it?" Stopped for a moment. How did he know that? It was true, he had always liked sitting by the window since he was a child. When I was at school, in the I frequented, even at home, I always chose a place where I could look outside. But this wasn't something he mentioned to anyone. It was a trait his personality that only those who had known him for a long time could notice. "It's just a preference," Ethan replied, trying to a neutral tone. Damien smiled but didn't say anything else. He just watched it for a few seconds longer than necessary before turning back his screen, as if he was satisfied with the reaction he elicited. This situation began to repeat itself constantly. Damien always made subtle comments, but they carried more weight than they seemed. He seemed to things about Ethan that weren't accessible to anyone, small but strangely precise details. "You never liked bitter coffee, right? Always a little more sugar than normal?" he said one day. While Ethan was preparing his drink in the pantry, Ethan felt the muscles in his face. It was true, but how did Damien know that? He had never seen you make coffee before, and even if he had, how would have noticed the exact amount of sugar? Another time, while they were talking about films, Damien mentioned a specific scene from a film Ethan watched as a child. "I remember that. When I saw this scene for the first time, I felt estranged, you know. That same kind of feeling we get when we're alone and realize something is wrong. But I bet you didn't feel that, right? You always liked that part." Ethan swallowed hard. How did he know that? It was such a small, insignificant detail. That movie was one of his as a child, and really that specific scene never bothered him. unlike other people. But how could Damien know this? The of being watched began to become a constant in Ethan's life. He began to feel that Damien was always close by, always listening, always analyzing every move. It seemed like he was studying Ethan, collecting information in a subtle way, as if he were putting together an invisible. It was then that Ethan started testing. He started changing small habits, changing his routine on purpose, took a different route to work, changed his lunchtime, started drinking coffee without sugar, just to see if Damien would notice. And he noticed. "Changed your path today, right? I thought it was strange not seeing you passing by at the same time," Damien said casually on any given day. Ethan, his stomach turned. How did he know? That route was different. There was no reason for Damien to be around or notice his absence. "Sometimes it's to change a little," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. Damien just nodded with that look that seemed to penetrate deeply, as if he reading Ethan's every thought. "You've come this far, but now you have to choose. Sign up and find out what's next, or leave without ever the outcome." The situation began to become unsustainable. Ethan felt like he was being watched all the time. He started to paranoid, to notice if there was anyone following him on the street, if his house was the way he left it when he left, and increasingly had the impression that Damien knew much more than he let on. But the question that tormented him most was, if Damien knew so much about him, then he was accessing his information somehow. Maybe he had hacked into his computer. Maybe he was following in his footsteps outside of work. Maybe he had talked to someone from his past. But who? He wasn't close to anyone at work, and his personal life was well protected. Fear began to his routine. He started avoiding Damien, cutting off conversations quickly, but whenever he tried to move away, he felt those eyes him from afar, always attentive, always waiting. Then one day, Damien said something that made Ethan realize that it wasn't just Ethan, some people spend their entire lives thinking they have, but the truth is that we never know who is watching us. Ethan felt an icy shiver run down his. This was no longer a simple conversation. It was a warning, or worse, a veiled threat. Ethan began to notice details that in isolation might not mean anything, but when added together they formed a disturbing pattern. At first, he to convince himself that Damien was just an observant guy, someone who paid attention to the people around him. But he soon realized that it went simple curiosity. It was as if Damien was collecting information about himself, piece by piece, until he put a complete picture of his life. One morning, as he was getting ready to leave the house, Ethan stopped for a moment at the front door. He a strange discomfort, a feeling that something wasn't right. He looked around, checked the windows, and double-checked that he had locked the back. He was never paranoid, but lately he felt an invisible presence around him, something he couldn't, but that made him uneasy. When I arrived at work, Damien was already there, as always. He was sitting at the table, with that smile on his face, as if he was waiting for something. When Ethan passed him, he heard a casual comment, but it made his entire body. "Did you sleep well, Ethan? I bet the strong wind this morning made a strange noise outside your window." Ethan stopped for a moment. The wind? The window? How did he know that the wind from the previous night had caused an uncomfortable noise right in his... Was it a coincidence, or was he nearby? "Yes, oh my, that was it," Ethan replied, trying to remain natural. Damien just smiled as if he was satisfied with the answer. From that day on, Ethan testing. He began to observe Damien in the same way he felt he was being observed. Little tests, subtle changes to the routine, just to see if would notice, and he always noticed. At lunch, Ethan decided to change the place where he usually sat, choosing a table further away, to the exit. The next day, Damien sat at exactly the same table. He also started changing his schedule, leaving a little earlier or taking longer from his break, but Damien always seemed to know where to find him. "Changed your schedule, huh?" said one day without taking his eyes off the computer screen. "I thought it would be more methodical." Ethan felt his throat dry. The tone of it was casual, but the implicit message was there. Damien was paying attention to him too much. That night, Ethan had trouble sleeping, felt a growing uneasiness, as if his privacy was being violated without him being able to see exactly how. It wasn't just about the information, Damien. It was about the way he used them, throwing little crumbs into the conversation, testing Ethan's as if he was having fun with it. Before continuing, I want to ask you a very important question. Have you ever experienced something bizarre, or know someone who has experienced something inexplicable? Video was inspired by a story left by a subscriber here in the comments, and your story could be next. So, tell me about your experience in the... I'm going to read everything, and who knows, maybe your story will become an exclusive video on the channel. You have something the world needs to know. This is the time to share. The next day, the situation escalated to a new level. Ethan arrived at work, found a yellow post-it stuck to his monitor. On it, there was only one sentence written: "Silence says more than words." His raced. He looked around, trying to see if anyone was paying attention to him. One seemed to notice anything strange. He took the paper and read it again. What did that mean? Who had left? He took a deep breath and threw in the trash, trying to convince himself that it was just some meaningless joke. But then, a few minutes later, approached his table and, without even looking at him, said in a carefree tone, "Some messages don't need an explanation, right, Ethan?" Ethan felt a run down his spine. Damien knew he was playing with it. At this point, Ethan was already sure that this was not normal. It wasn't just or a wrong impression. Damien knew things he shouldn't have known. He paid attention to details that no one else noticed, and worse, seemed to enjoy provoking Ethan, testing his limits, seeing how far he could go before reacting. Then the following week came the worst sign of all. Was leaving work when he felt a strange sensation of déjà vu. He looked around and noticed that Damien was also leaving at that moment, walking up behind him. At first he tried to ignore it, but when he entered the subway station, he saw Damien entering through the same door. When he off, Damien got off right behind, and when he turned the corner to enter the street where his house was, he heard footsteps behind him. Heart skipped a beat. He quickened his pace. The footsteps behind him also sped up. His building was just a few meters away. He pretended not to anything and quickly entered, locking the door behind him. His chest rose and fell with heavy breathing. He looked through trying to see if Damien was still there, but the street seemed empty. Was he imagining things? Could it be that your mind was connections where none existed? Ethan needed answers, but most of all I needed to know if I really was safe. Ethan to live in a constant state of alert. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, but with each passing day, proved that he knew more than anyone should know. The subtle glances, the seemingly casual comments, the way he always seemed to be in the right at the right time. All of this was forming a pattern that Ethan couldn't ignore. That's when it happened. Was an ordinary afternoon at the office, and Ethan was concentrating on his work when he felt Damien approaching. He didn't need to look. It was him. The surrounding silence changed, as if the entire room had held its breath. Damien pulled up a chair and sat next to Ethan, his arms on the table as calmly as ever. "Have you ever wondered what people really remember from their childhood?" Damien asked casually, without away from the computer screen. Ethan frowned. What did he mean by that? "I think we remember some memorable moments," he replied. Without interest. "Yes, remarkable moments, like that day you got lost in the supermarket when you were 7. Ethan froze. His mind immediately went to that moment. He remembered it clearly. He was holding his mother's hand, distracted. When he let go for a second to look something on a shelf, when he turned around, she was no longer there. The feeling of despair, the anguish of everywhere and not recognizing any face, all that came back in a matter of seconds. He had never told this story to anyone. The air thicker around him. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but his heart was racing. "How do you that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Damien smiled, but didn't respond immediately. He just tilted his head slightly, as if was amused by Ethan's discomfort. "People leave traces," he said finally. "Some things are right in front of us. You just need to know where to." Ethan felt a bitter taste in his mouth. He wanted to believe there was a logical explanation for it. Maybe Damien had something in a random conversation. Maybe he was deducing based on some detail that he himself didn't notice. But the more I thought it, the less sense it made. That memory was not on his social media. It wasn't in any conversation he had at work. It wasn't I mentioned at meetings with friends. It was a part of his life that only his family knew about. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew he'd keep pretending that it wasn't real. Damien knew much more than he should have. In the following days, Ethan felt that something had Damien's presence became even more intense. He seemed to appear at the most unexpected moments, always with that look, always with that relaxed posture, as if he was just waiting. Ethan started avoiding contact, changing his schedule, leaving or later just to avoid running into him, but it was useless. Damien always seemed to be one step ahead. Then it happened again. Ethan was in cafeteria getting a coffee when he felt Damien approaching. He was already prepared to ignore it, but then he heard something that made blood run cold. "Do you still have that notebook with the blue cover?" The cup almost fell out of his hands. He around slowly, facing Damien. "What notebook? The one you had when you were a kid, where he wrote down all his ideas, his dreams?" where he made strange drawings that no one understood. Ethan felt his vision darken for an instant. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He immediately the notebook. It was a special object to him as a child. He kept all his thoughts, his little secrets, things he never told anyone. He hours writing, drawing, creating stories in silence. But that notebook, no one other than his family knew it existed, and he hadn't seen that in years. "Have you been talking to anyone in my family?" Ethan asked, feeling his voice crack slightly. Damien let out a laugh. "You ask a lot of questions, Ethan, but some answers are better when we discover them ourselves." Ethan felt his heart beating hard, that it felt like it was going to come out of his chest. He needed to get out of there. I needed to understand what's happening, but more than anything, he needed to find out how much Damien knew about his life. Ethan felt his heart against his ribs, as if it wanted to escape his chest. The air in the cafeteria felt heavier, almost suffocating. He stared at waiting for an answer, anything that made sense, but all he received was that enigmatic smile, as if he were being part of a game whose he didn't understand. He couldn't just let this go. That was his life, his privacy, his past. He needed to how Damien knew so much. Taking a deep breath, Ethan forced his voice to sound steady. "Have you been talking to anyone in my family?" asked, trying to hide his discomfort. Damien raised his eyebrows slightly as if he found the question curious. "Do I really need it?" he replied in almost amused tone. The way he said it sent a chill up Ethan's spine. That wasn't an answer, it was a psychological game. So subtle that he knew a lot more than he was letting on. Ethan clenched his fists. He wanted answers, but he knew he couldn't react impulsively. Said that Damien was waiting for just that, waiting to see how far he would go, waiting to test his patience, his ability to remain calm. He decided change his approach. "You watch people, don't you?" he said, trying to seem unconcerned. "He's good at noticing patterns, at noticing details." Damien smiled as if he was satisfied. "Yes, I just observe." "Very well." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. That explained something. At the same time, it explained nothing. Observe? No one was watching at that point. No one should know such intimate things just by paying, but there's a difference between observing and knowing things that no one else knows. Ethan continued, crossing his arms. "How did you know about my notebook? How did you know about the supermarket? This is nowhere." Damien tilted his head to the side, as if he were analyzing Ethan in a new way, like a scientist observing the behavior of an experiment. "You'd be what can be found if you know where to look." Ethan's patience was running out. "What does that mean?" This time Damien actually laughed, an almost mocking laugh. "Do you think you're invisible, Ethan? Do you think your memories belong only to you?" Ethan didn't know what to answer. There's something in Damien's tone that deeply disturbed him, as if he were suggesting something much greater than just coincidences or logical. "Do you remember what you searched on your computer last week?" Damien casually. Ethan's blood ran cold. He remembered. The previous week, uncomfortable with everything that was happening, he spent hours psychological manipulation, silent stalking, and even people who used advanced observation techniques to control others. "But he this at home, on your personal computer." He didn't respond, he just kept his eyes fixed on Damien, waiting to see how far he would go with, "Or maybe we should talk about that night," continued Damien, playing with the rim of his coffee cup. "You felt like there was someone outside your window." Ethan felt a shock of adrenaline course through his body. That particular night, he had felt something. He couldn't explain it, but he had the strangest feeling that there was someone outside his house, standing on the sidewalk. He remembered lying motionless for several minutes, not having the courage to look out the window, waiting for any sound, any movement. But he convinced himself that it was just his imagination and went to sleep. But Damien, he was mentioning it now. Ethan finally realized what happening. This was not just a matter of observation. This wasn't just a psychological game within the office. Damien was his life. Somehow he was getting information that no one should have. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. His mind was processing there were only a few possible explanations for all of this, and none of them were good. He would need answers. But above, I needed to know how far Damien was capable of going. In the days following the confrontation, Ethan felt his paranoia reach unbearable levels. Try to act normally, maintain his routine, ignore the constant discomfort in the back of his head that made him look over his shoulder every moment. The truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. Everything around him carried a different weight, as if the world he knew had been slightly distorted, enough for only him to notice. Damien, on the other hand, seemed unchanged. He was still in the office, moving through the corridors with the same as always, smiling politely at his colleagues, interacting as if nothing unusual was happening. But Ethan's something different now. Something he couldn't name before, but now seemed obvious. Damien didn't just know a lot about him, he liked it. The game. He liked Ethan's reaction. He liked knowing he was in control, even without having to lift a finger. Ethan needed to act. I needed to out more. So he started doing his own investigation. He began to observe Damien in the same way he had done. Every movement, every detail. He wanted to find flaws, loopholes, anything that would reveal how this man knew so much. But no matter how hard he tried, Damien left a trace. No clues about his past, no indication of where he lived, nothing. That's when Ethan decided to go further. One afternoon, while was busy, he managed to quickly access Damien's computer. His heart was beating fast as his fingers ran across the keyboard. He opened folders. Files, looked for anything that indicated some kind of obsessive behavior, research records, anything about him. But there was nothing. Nothing. Computer was clean. Too clean. Ethan felt a chill down his spine. Who keeps a completely empty computer? No personal photos, no loose files, nothing than basic work documents. As if Damien were a shadow, someone with no past, no digital footprints. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every ran through his mind. He thought about reporting Damien to HR, about telling someone, but he felt like no one would believe him. What did he? Just a feeling, a growing fear, and a series of coincidences that only he seemed to see. That's when it happened. The next morning, when he at the office, Damien's desk was empty. There was no computer, no documents, not even the personal objects he kept there. It was as if he had existed. Ethan looked around, confused. He asked his colleagues what had happened. "Oh, he resigned yesterday," said one of them out of nowhere. He said he received a better offer and left. Ethan felt a chill, out of nowhere. Just like, did he leave any contact details, a phone, any way to talk to him? No, he took his things and disappeared. Ethan felt an emptiness open him. How does someone disappear like that? How could someone who knew so much about your life just disappear? Leaving no. In the following days, he tried to find information about Damien. He searched on social media, in old company records, in any corner where could be a trace of its existence. But it was as if Damien had never been there. No profile, no photo, no relevant information. Didn't know what to think. On the one hand, I felt relief. That weight, that shadow in his life was gone, but at the same time, there was something unsettling about the way it all happened. Because deep down, Ethan knew that normal people don't just disappear. Normal people traces. Normal people have a past, and Damien was anything but normal. To this day, Ethan wonders, who really was that man? Never completely disappear. You can ignore them, pretend they're not there, but they continue to watch you, silent, waiting for the right moment to themselves. What happened to Ethan was not an accident. There are people who make a game of it. They know everything you before you even notice their presence. They study every detail, every movement, every word. But what if I told you that this more than you think, that maybe right now someone has already done this to you, and you still don't realize it? You've ever felt that strange shiver, that inexplicable feeling of being watched? Comment now. I know what it's like. If you or someone you know has through something like this, share your story in the comments. What happened to is not an isolated case, and perhaps by commenting, you will realize that you are not alone in this experience. But this is just beginning. There's something even more disturbing you need to see now. You can move house, change the locks, reinforce the doors and yourself that you are safe. But what if the danger is not outside? What if he's already inside, silently watching you? They're stories that make you question everything you believe about security. Do you trust the walls that surround you? Are you sure you are really when you lie down to sleep? Some houses hide secrets that should never be discovered, and in the next video, I'll tell you a story of a man who thought he knew every corner of the place where he lived, until he discovered that he wasn't living alone. If you ever felt an inexplicable shiver, heard a sound that shouldn't be there, or had the strange sensation that something or someone was watching you, your own home, comment now, I know what like. And if this story left you uneasy, leave a like right now, because this helps me to continue bringing real stories, will make you see the world in a different way. But now don't waste time. Click on the video appears on the screen and discover what was hidden inside that house, and why no one should have ever found it.